Good morning, Lines. This is Jen, and today I want to talk about the Unabomber and MKUltra. I'm not going to say a lot about it. I've done a lot of research on it, but for the purposes of this video, I want to focus in on an article written by The Guardian. And you can go out and read this article yourself. So I plan on reading the article, but and it's kind of long, a little bit long. But if you don't want to hear me read it, I suggest you go out and read it yourself. So I want to start off with the deception that is perpetrated by the United States, which I say is only a military, and that the United States, being a military, is entitled to or allowed to have secrets and keep those secrets from the general public. They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to use tactics and strategies to mislead people. They're not supposed to do it to its own citizens. However, um, if they let the secrets or tell the truth, then the enemy will know it also. So it may not be their intention to mislead their own citizens that they're supposed to protect, but it is their intention to mislead the enemy. And in misleading the enemy or lying to the enemy, or strategizing against the enemy, they strategize to some extent against us. Now, that's what the military is allowed to do. So, what the military is not allowed to do is experiment on its own people without their consent. And we go back to I think it's the Nuremberg trials, right? So, I want to talk a little bit about Ted Kaczynski and some thoughts that I have on him and his history with his parents. So, uh, what started this with me is that recently Trump was on TV and he talked about Ted Kaczynski and his uncle, Dr. John Trump, were at MIT together. They were not at MIT together. Okay, so I don't think that he was intentionally lying. I think that he was going through information that was released back in December 26th of 2024. A bunch of information was released, and so he was probably reading through this information and misremembered something. That's my theory. So if he misremembered something having to do with his uncle, Dr. John Trump, and Ted Kaczynski and MIT, he, in his mind, wrongly put those things together. But why were all of them mentioned in these papers that were released? Okay, so there's got to be some sort of link in the papers that were released that he misremembered and put them both together at MIT. I think they both were working. I misstated that. They were both involved in MKUltra. Donald John Trump, willingly, and Ted Kaczynski, a subject of the experiments. So I think the fact that they were both involved in MKUltra was what he should have said, and he misremembered it as being both involved in MIT. So Dr. John Trump was at MIT, but Kaczynski, there's no record of Kaczynski ever being at MIT. But Dr. John Trump was involved in MK Ultra, and Kaczynski was a subject of MK Ultra. I think it's important to go over a little bit of background information and just keeping in mind that MK Ultra started before most people think it started. It started, I think, back in like the 1920s. So it's like MK Ultra Light. It wasn't just about LSD in the 60s and that kind of thing. It started way before that. as an effort to figure out how to mislead, strategize against, and form tactics against an enemy, and to predict the human behavior, the behavior of a person, which should be the enemy. They started experimenting on their own people so that they could gather intelligence in order to figure out how to use that intelligence against generally humans, but specifically enemies. And this helps keep the United States, the military, in power. So MKUltra was something that was an experimentation. It involved a lot of different methods, including medications. And they not only went to Harvard University and experimented on those people, but they also went to hospitals, asylums, prisons, um, and universities, and probably some other places that they haven't that I haven't found on available in information. There is a man who wrote a book on Ted Kaczynski, and I was listening to a video cast about it, and he says most of the information that he gathered, you had to go to Washington to the library to find, and even then, it wasn't in places where it should have been. He had to like go into other files and other do odd random searches and come across the information almost by accident. And that's how he found the information. So I don't have his information. I don't recall the author or the name of the book, but I wanted to let you know that the information that I have available to me, that these writers had to go to Washington to find the information that they have. The information I have is mostly internet based, and these authors that talked about this stuff. So Ted Kaczynski was born. I have some notes here, and at about a couple of months old, he was sent to a hospital due to a reaction to some medication that he had. And this is where I start thinking about all the experiments that were done on babies in the past, the experiments that were done on children. There were even experiments, I think Yale did an experiment on some boys that were triplets. And what they did with these boys was I believe there was a show about it, and I believe what they were saying was that they paid a woman to be impregnated. She had triplets, and they sent the 3 boys to, um, different families with different, family dynamics. So these boys, triplets, one was sent to a poor family where the parents were very involved in the child's life. The next boy was sent to, um middle class family where the parents were so involved, and then the third boy was sent to a wealthy family where the parents worked and had very little involvement in their son's life. So like the younger son grew up, the most not the younger son, the first one that grew up in the poor family where the parents were very involved, turned out really to be the most healthy of the 3. I think you can go out and research this. There was a show on it, and that's how I came across the information. It was really interesting, the information that came out about Yale and doing these experiments. So these experiments have been done for a long time. So when I read that Ted Kaczynski his mother said he was a happy, bubbly baby boy, and then he had an allergic reaction to medication, and then he went into the hospital, and she couldn't see him for a couple months, and when she got him back, it's like he wouldn't look her in the eyes. He wouldn't make eye contact. And then I looked up, well, what kind of medication did they give him in the hospital? And these are um, questionable medications like Benadryl, um, chlorothiameton, hydrocortisone, adrenaline, zinc oxide. These kind of medications, some of them aren't given to babies unless they're very, very, very sick. I don't know how sick Ted Kaczynski was. I don't know what medication they gave him that made him sick, that gave him this allergic reaction that caused him to go into the hospital. But I find it odd that he was born in 1942 in Chicago. You know, we know this Chicago, Illinois is one of the most, even today, corrupt places in America. And he was in the hospital there, and his mother distinguished between before and after. Before he was a happy baby, before he was just completely different. So I just wanted to keep that in mind. Ted Kaczynski also enrolled at Harvard at the age of 16. So I don't know if these medications had anything to do with the outcome of his intelligence, or the fact that seemed to be sort of autistic after. Um, just to keep that in mind whenever we're talking about what we're going to talk about, which is the Guardian um, article that came out. It's, I think, a few years old. I have the exact copy of it. So it says it's called A Lesson in Hate. It's from 21 June 2000. This is by Alston Chase. Let's see if I can change this around. So a while back, I was listening to some videos on YouTube, and I came across one where somebody had said that they heard Trump telling a story about how his uncle was working at MIT, and while there, he taught Ted Kaczynski. That Ted Kaczynski was at MIT at the same time his uncle was, and I don't know why, but for some reason, this just kept sticking in my mind, and I couldn't let it go. I was thinking there had to be some reason why he said this, and even if they're calling it a fictional story, I couldn't help but to wonder, in Trump's mind, what was he thinking when he said this? What was his purpose for even bringing it up? And after I thought about it for a while, I thought, well, maybe his uncle and Ted Kaczynski did cross paths together, but maybe it wasn't at MIT. Maybe it was somewhere else. I really didn't know anything about Trump's uncle, who happens to be Dr. John G. Trump. And I didn't know anything about really Ted Kaczynski until I saw his nickname, the Unabomber, and then I realized who it was they were talking about. Of course, I didn't know anything really about the Unabomber, other than that he had sent bombs out to some people and hurt some people. So I thought, well, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about Dr. John G. Trump, and I want to know about the Unabomber, and I want to know why, in Trump's mind, he connected these two people. And so I started doing a little research. So let's look at some of the stuff I found. Okay, so this is the Guardian, Alston Chase. I find some really interesting information in here, given what I've told you and the fact that um, Trump seemed to misspeak and said that his uncle, Dr. Donald Trump, and Kaczynski went to MIT together. You'll just have to listen to what this article says. I find it fascinating, and I think you'll find it interesting at the least. So in 1958, let me give you I don't have the website, but it's on the Guardian, and just search Kaczynski. So, A Lesson in Hate. In 1958, a brilliant but socially inept 15-year-old began his studies at Harvard. Like many of his peers, he volunteered for a number of personality tests in return for a small fee. Only these were no ordinary tests, and the student was Ted Kaczynski, now better known as the Unabomber, and this article is by Alston Chase. Originally, it was Unibomber because he was targeting universities. Like many Harvard alumni, I sometimes wonder the neighborhood when I return to Cambridge, reminiscing about the old days and musing on how different my life has been from what I hoped and expected then. Last fall, my return there was prompted not by nostalgia, but by curiosity. I found myself a few blocks north of Harvard on Divinity Avenue, number 7. Divinity Avenue is a modern multi-story academic building today, housing the university's Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology. In 1959, a comfortable old house stood on the site, known as the Annex. It served as a laboratory in which staff members of the Department of Social Relations conducted research on human subjects. There, from the fall of 1959 through the spring of 1962, Harvard psychologists, led by Professor Henry A. Murray, conducted a disturbing and what would now be seen as ethically indefeasible experiment on 22 undergraduates. To preserve the anonymity of these student guinea pigs, experiments referred to individuals by code name only. One of these students, whom they dubbed Lawful, was Theodore John Kaczynski, who would one day be known as the Unabomber, and who would later mail or deliver 16 package bombs to scientists, academics, and others over 17 years, killing 3 people and injuring 23. I first heard of the Murray experiment from Kaczynski himself. We had begun corresponding in July of 1998, a couple of months after a federal court in Sacramento sentenced him to life without possibility of parole. Kaczynski, I quickly discovered, was an indefatigable correspondent. He hinted darkly that the Murray Center seemed to feel it had something to hide. One of his defense investigators, he said, reported that the center had told participating psychologists not to talk with his defense team. Through research, the Murray Center, and in the Harvard archives, I found that among its other purposes, Henry Murray's experiment was intended to measure how people react under stress. Murray subjected his unwitting students, including Kaczynski, to intense interrogation, what Murray himself called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks, assaulting his subjects' ego and most cherished ideals and beliefs. My quest was specific, to determine what effects, if any, the experiment may have on Kaczynski. Kaczynski was accepted by Harvard in the spring of 1958. He was not yet 16 years old. One friend remembers urging Kaczynski's father, Turk, not to let the boy go arguing. He's too young, too immature, and Harvard is too impersonal. But Turk wouldn't listen. Ted's going to Harvard was an ego trip for him, the friend recalls. Murray, a wealthy and blue-blooded New Yorker, was both a scientist and a humanist. Before the war, he had been the director of the Harvard Psychological Clinic. During it, he served in the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, helping develop psychological screening tests for applicants and monitoring military experiments on brainwashing. After the war, Murray returned to Harvard, where he continued to refine techniques of personality assessment. By 1950, he had resumed studies on Harvard undergraduates that he began in rudimentary form. Before the war, titled Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men, the experiment in which Kaczynski participated was the last and most elaborate of these. In their post-war form, these experiments focused on stressful interpersonal relations, designing confrontations akin to those mock interrogations he had helped to orchestrate for the OSS. Kaczynski has said that he was pressured
into participating. His hesitation turned out to be sensible. Researchers have volunteered almost no information about the experiment in which they would participate. Each was simply asked to answer yes to the following question: would you be willing to contribute to the solution of certain psychological problems, parts of an ongoing program of research in the development of personality? By serving as a subject in a series of experiments or taking a number of tests, average about 2 hours a week, through the academic year, at the current college rate per hour. In fact, it would never be clear what the certain psychological problems were, and the task that served as the centerpiece for this undertaking appears remarkably similar to the old OSS stress test. Students would be given the third degree, but whereas the OSS applicants must have known that enduring unpleasant interrogations would be part of their job, these students did not. The intent was to catch them by surprise, to deceive them, and to brutalize them. The students were led to believe that they would debate their philosophy of life with another student like themselves. In fact, they were confronted by a well-prepared stooge, a lawyer. When the subject arrived, he was escorted to a brilliantly lighted room and seated in front of a one-way mirror. A motion picture camera recorded his every move and facial expression through a hole in the wall. Electrodes leading to machines that recorded his heart and respiratory rates were attached to his body. Forrest Robinson, the author of a biography of Murray, has described what happened next. As instructed, the unwitting subject attempted to represent and to defend his personal philosophy of life. Invariably, however, he was frustrated and finally brought to expressions of real anger by the withering assault of his older, more sophisticated opponent, while fluctuations in the subject's pulse and respirations were measured. Not surprisingly, most participants found this highly unpleasant, even traumatic. We were led into the room with bright lights, very bright. One of them, code-named Kringle, called afterward. I had a sensation somewhat akin to someone being strapped on the electric chair with these electrodes. I really started getting hit real hard. Wham, wham, wham. And me get tinge hotter and more irritated, and my heartbeat going up and sweating terribly. Right away, said another, code-named Trump. And I find it interesting that Kaczynski and Trump are both in this article by The Guardian, and Trump today recalls, this was back in 2000, Trump in December or earlier this year, 2025, put Kaczynski and Dr. John Trump together as being at MIT, whereas they were both involved in this program, one as a subject and one as the experimenter or the head of the experiments. And now we have a codenamed Trump in here. So right away, said another, codenamed Trump, describing his experiment afterward, I didn't like the interrogation. Dr. G came waltzing over and he put me on those electrodes, but in that process, while he was doing that, kind of whistling, and then Mr. R, who was bubbling over, dancing around, started to talk to me about he liked my suit. The buzzer would ring or something like that. We were supposed to begin. He was being sarcastic or pretty much of a wise guy. And the first thing that entered my mind was to get up and ask him outside immediately. But that was out of the question because the electrodes and the movie and all that. I kind of sat there and began to fume And then he went on and he got my goat, and I couldn't think of what to say. And then he came along and they took off my electrodes. During the last year of the experiment, Murray made the students available to his graduate student assistants to serve as guinea pigs for their own research projects. By graduation, as Kenneth Keniston, one of the researchers, summarized the process later, each student had spent approximately 200 hours in the research and had provided hundreds of pages of information about himself, his beliefs, his past life, his family, his college life and development, his fantasies, his hopes and dreams. Why were the students willing to endure this ongoing stress and probing into their private lives? Some who had assisted Murray in the experiment confessed to me that they wondered about this themselves, but they and we can only speculate that some of the students, including Kaczynski, did it for money, that some, again probably including Kaczynski, had doubts about their own psychic health and were seeking reassurance about it, that some, suffering from Harvard's well-known enemy, were lonely and needed someone to talk to, and that some simply had an interest in helping to advance scientific knowledge. But in truth, we don't know. Alden E. Westman, a former research associate of Murray, who has long been bothered by the unethical dimension of this study, said to me recently, "Later I thought, we took and used them, and what we did we give them in return. And what did we give them in return? What was the purpose of the experiment?" Keniston told me that he wasn't sure what the goals were. Murray was not the most systematic scientist, he explained. Murray himself gave curiously unequivocal answers. Sometimes he suggested that his research might have no value at all. Cui bono? He once asked, "As the data stand, they are nothing but raw data, meaningless as such, and the question is, what meaning? What intellectual news can be extracted from them?" In another context, he asked, "Are the costs in man-hours incurred by our elaborate multiple procedures far greater than any possible gains in knowledge?" Such unequivocal prompts one to ask if the experiment could have had a purpose that Murray was reluctant to divulge. Was the multiform assessments project intended, at least in part, to help the CIA determine how to test or break down an individual's ability to withstand interrogation? The writer Alexander Cockburn has asked whether the students might have been given the hallucinogenic drug LSD without their knowing, possibly at the request of the CIA. By the late 50s, according to some, Murray had become quite interested in hallucinogenics, including LSD and psilocybin. And soon after Murray's experiments on Kaczynski and his classmates were underway in 1960, Timothy Leary returned to Harvard and, with Murray's blessing, began his experiments with psilocybin. In his autobiography, Leary, who would dedicate the rest of his life to promoting hallucinogenic drugs, described Murray as the wizard of personality assessment who, as OSS chief psychologist, had monitored military experiments on brainwashing and sodium amytal interrogation. Murray expressed great interest in our drug research project and offered his support. It is clear that Murray's experiment deeply affected at least some of its subjects. Even 25 years later, some recall the unpleasantness. In 1987, Kringle remembered the anger and embarrassment, the glass partition, the electrodes and wires running up our sleeves. Likewise, 25 years later, Drill still had very vivid general memories of the experience. I remember someone putting electrodes and blood pressure counter on my arm just before the filming. I was startled by my interlocutor's venom. I remember responding with unabating rage. And 25 years later, Locust wrote, I remember appearing one afternoon for a debate that began hooking up electrodes and sat in a chair with bright lights and being told a movie was being made. I remember him attacking me, even insulting me for my values or my opinions I had expressed in my written material. I remembered being shocked by the severity of the attack, and I remember feeling helpless to respond. What is the point of this? They have deceived me, telling me there was going to be a discussion where in fact there was an attack. We don't know what effect this experiment may have had on Kaczynski. I did not have access to his records and therefore cannot attest to his degree of alienation then. Kaczynski must certainly have been among the most vulnerable of Murray's experimental subjects, at a point the researchers seem to have missed. He was among the youngest and the poorest of the group. He may have come from a dysfunctional home. As Kaczynski's college life continued, outwardly he seemed to be adjusting to Harvard, but inwardly he increasingly seethed. According to Sally Johnson, the forensic psychiatrist who examined Kaczynski, he began worrying about his health. He began having terrible nightmares. He started having fantasies about taking revenge against a society that he increasingly viewed as an evil force obsessed with imposing conformism through psychological controls. Those thoughts upset Kaczynski all the more because they exposed his ineffectuality. Johnson reported that he would become horribly angry with himself because he could not express this fury openly. I never attempted to put any such fantasies into effect, he quoted from the writings, because I was too strongly conditioned against any defiance of authority. I could not have committed a crime of revenge, even a relatively minor one, because my fear of being caught and punished was all out of proportion to the actual danger of being caught. Kaczynski felt that justice demanded that he take revenge on society, but he lacked the personal resources at the time to do so. He had always been, a good boy. Instead, he would seek escape. He began to dream about breaking away from society and living a primitive life. According to Johnson, he began to study information about wild edible plants and to spend time learning about the wilderness. And like many American intellectuals before him, he began to form a plan to seek personal renewal in nature. Today, society would not tolerate the deceptions inherent in the Murray experiments, but different standards prevailed them, and its ethics were definitely acceptable in their day, but the ethics of the day were wrong. And they framed Kaczynski's first encounter with a reckless scientific value system that evaluated or elevated the pursuit of scientific truth above all human rights. When soon after, Kaczynski began to worry about the possibility of mind control, he was not giving vent to paranoid delusions. In view of Murray's experiment, he was not only rational but right. The university and the psychiatric establishment had been willing accomplices in an experiment that had treated human beings as guinea pigs and had treated them brutally. Here is a powerful logical foundation for Kaczynski's latterly expressed conviction that academics, in particular scientists, were thoroughly compromised servants of the system, employed in the development of techniques for the behavioral control of populations. It was the confluence of two streams of development that transformed Kaczynski into the Unabomber. One stream was personal, fed by his anger toward his family and those who he felt had slighted or hurt him in high school and college. The other derived from his philosophical critique of society and its institutions and reflected the culture of despair he encountered at Harvard and later. The Murray experiment contained both psychological and philosophical components, may well have fed both streams. A longer version of this article appears in this month's issue of Atlantic Monthly. So then we have the manifesto, and the manifesto is available at archive.org, and you can read Kaczynski's manifesto. And some people today who are against advanced technology and artificial intelligence, at least in the way it's being presented now, refer back to Kaczynski's manifesto and says that people like Kaczynski were right all along. I haven't read all of his manifesto yet, but if you like, you can go ahead and read it. Like I said, it's on archive.org. And I don't know, you can leave some comments on what you think of his manifesto. It's kind of long. I think he's got 144 points in it, which is interesting. The Bible also refers to the number 144,000, but 144, 4 and 4 is 8 plus 1 is 9, which Tesla refers to 3, 6, and 9. I don't know if he did that on purpose or if 144 was just a random number. So there's a lot that can be learned from Kaczynski and MKUltra and the experiments. This is just a fraction of the information I came up with on my research, but I wanted to share this with you, and I really wanted to read the article because it talks about Trump, and Kaczynski, his code name was Lawful. It doesn't talk about Trump specifically, but it mentions Trump in the article. So go back and consider reading the article, the manifesto and the article, and let me know what you think about it. Okay, so like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.